Hi, welcome back to Anatomy Lab. Today we're going to discuss the mammalian skull as exemplified by the cat. In general, mammalian skulls have a facial region which includes the eye socket and the nostrils, and a large backside because of our enlarged cerebrum. This is called the cranial region of the skull, which includes also the external ear canal. And then that eye socket that I mentioned is called the orbit. This nostril is called the external nares. And then confluent with the orbit is another depression, or you can call it a cavity on the backside of the orbit. That's called the temporal fossa or temporal fenestra. So in life, this is where you'll see one of the powerful jaw adductor muscles, the temporalis muscle, that allow you to close your mouth and take a bite. And this prominent structure here, our cheekbones, is called the zygomatic arch. Partially separating the orbit from the temporal fossa in the cat are two post-orbital processes. And this upper rim of the orbit is called the supraorbital arch. On the back side of the skull, you'll see a huge hole called the foramen magnum, through which the spinal cord passes. And flanking it in mammals are two occipital condyles for the articulation of the first cervical vertebra, which we call the atlas. So this is an atlas. And if you remember, in the vertebral column unit, there are two huge concavities in the atlas called the superior articular facets, which serve for the articulation of the occipital condyles. So they fit together. So they create a condyloid joint which allows for head movements. And then there are two huge bulges here in the ear region called the tympanic bulla. The tympanic bulla has a hole, which is the external auditory meatus, or external ear opening. And then inside, if you enter the external auditory meatus, you'll reach the tympanic cavity inside, where the three middle ear ossicles are located. And then back to the back side of the skull, there's a ridge here called the superior nuchal line, also called as the lambdoidal ridge, and it has a prominence there. The peak is called the external occipital protuberance. On the ventral surface, the palate side, you'll see the hard palate forming the roof of the mouth. And then posterior to it is the internal nares, which is continuous with the external nares. So air will flow through the external nares and then goes out of the internal nares into the pharynx. These two holes here are the incisive foramina. And this here, there's a depression here on the ventral side of the zygomatic arch called the mandibular fossa. So those are the mandibular fossae. And this is the region where the lower jaw, the mandibles, articulate. So this is another cat skull with an articulated jaw. You'll see that the condyloid process of the mandible fits with the mandibular fossa. Again, mandibular fossa. And then just move medially to it is a tinier fossa called the pterygoid fossa. Let's examine the dermal bones of the skull roof. So anteriorly, just dorsal to the external nares, are the paired nasal bones. And then if you move more dorsally, you'll reach the forehead, composed of the frontal bones, also paired. Then move more posteriorly are the paired parietal bones. If you move more posteriorly, here's another cat skull. Posterior to the parietals is a triangular bone called the interparietal, the boundary of which with the occipital bone on the back side of the skull is not very clear. There should be a suture separating the interparietal from the occipital on the back side of the skull. The occipital is not part of the dermal bone or the dermatocranium. If you look inside the orbit, there's a bone there with a hole, and this bone is the lacrimal bone inside the orbit, and that hole there is the nasolacrimal duct opening. It's a connection between the orbit and the nasal cavity inside here. The reason why sometimes tears coming from inside the orbit would drain into the nasal cavity and goes out of your nose, because the nasal cavity and the orbit are connected via the nasolacrimal duct. Okay? And that bone bearing that nasolacrimal duct opening is the lacrimal bone. And those are the dermal bones of the skull roof. Let's examine the dermal bones of the upper jaw and also the palate. So there are a paired set of bones on either side of the external nares. There's the premaxilla, and beside it is the larger maxilla. And then beside the maxilla is the jugal bone. The jugal bone partly forms the zygomatic arch, and the latter half of the zygomatic arch is formed by the temporal bone. So the temporal bone has a zygomatic process, and this flat portion of the temporal bone on each side of your temples is called the squamous portion of the temporal bone. So there are three portions to the temporal bone. It's what anatomists call as a composite bone, because it's made up of a fusion of previously separate bones. So this is the squamous portion, and another portion is this bulge here, which are already ruptured, the tympanic bulla. So the tympanic bulla composes the tympanic portion of the temporal bone. And the third portion of the temporal bone is the petrous portion of the temporal bone. And it consists of the petromastoid bone located inside the skull and houses the inner ear apparatus. And so you can see it obviously in an external view. You have to view a sagittal section of the skull to view much of the petromastoid bone, but a part of it is visible externally, and this is the projection here called the mastoid process. The mastoid process is part of the petromastoid bone, which in turn is the petrous portion of the temporal bone. So again, just to clarify that there's the squamous portion of the temporal bone, the tympanic portion of the temporal bone, also called the tympanic bulla, and then the petromastoid bone, which is also the petrous portion of the temporal bone, and its externally visible portion is the mastoid process. Right, so we turn to the palate. So we have here the hard palate, composing the roof of the mouth cavity. The anterior portion of the hard palate is formed by the premaxilla. The premaxilla bears the incisors, and posterior to it, the hard palate is also composed of the maxillary bone, the maxilla. The maxilla bears the rest of the teeth. And then posterior to it, the hard palate is also formed by the palatine bones. So premaxilla, maxilla, palatine, forming the palate. So you have already encountered the premaxilla and maxilla in the maxillary arch, and that's because these two bones have what's called as processes, or different portions, different subparts, if you will. This portion here are the frontal processes. So this is the frontal process of the premaxilla, frontal process of the premaxilla, and this one is the frontal process of the maxilla. And on the palate, the portion that forms the hard palate are the palatal processes. Palatal process of premaxilla, palatal process of maxilla. The maxillary bone also has an alveolar process. This is the portion that bears the teeth. And then there's a small zygomatic process of the maxilla. And the maxillary bone also forms the anterior portion of the orbit. So this portion of the maxilla is called the orbital process of the maxilla. It's the one bearing this foramen here called the infraorbital foramen. So this part, the maxilla, again is the orbital process of the maxilla. We turn to the back side of the skull to see the occipital bone. There's only one occipital bone in mammals, and it forms the two occipital condyles and the foramen magnum. There's also another process formed by the occipital bone called the jugular process. It's more posterior to this other process we talked about, the mastoid process, which is part of the temporal bone. So the mastoid process belongs to the temporal, the jugular process belongs to the occipital. The occipital bone also extends here to the ventral side of the skull. So this is still the occipital bone, all the way here, where you'll see the suture separating the occipital from the sphenoid bones. So this is also already the sphenoid area. What are the sphenoid bones? Just next to the occipital is the base sphenoid, and this bone anterior to it is the presphenoid, and then forming a wing-like structure are the alisphenoids. The alisphenoids extend all the way here dorsally in the medial wall of the orbit. So this is still the alisphenoid, and it is contiguous with the temporal bone, the squamous portion of the temporal. The presphenoid also has a visible portion in the medial wall of the orbit, and it's this bone here, contiguous with the alisphenoid, is the orbitosphenoid. that visible portion of the pre-sphenoid. Visible portion in the orbit is the orbitosphenoid. So again, from the backside, occipital, base sphenoid, pre-sphenoid, alisphenoids extend dorsally in the orbit, meets the temporal squamous portion. Pre-sphenoid also visible in the orbit as the orbitosphenoid. And then if you move more anteriorly than the sphenoids, you'll begin to see inside the nasal cavity the vomer. So this is already the vomer. And this hole here is the internal nares. This is the sagittal section of the cat skull. There are three main cavities, partitions of the brain cavity. So this larger one is the cerebral fossa, or cerebral cavity, if you want. This is where the cerebrums are lodged. Posterior to it is the cerebellar fossa, containing the cerebellum. And this smaller anterior cavity or subdivision is the olfactory fossa, containing the olfactory lobes. Olfactory fossa. This partition here between the cerebral and cerebellar fossae is the tentorium. This bone here, which contains the internal auditory meatus, continues with the external auditory meatus, is called the petromastoid bone. This is what we mentioned earlier as the petrous portion of the temporal bone. Right, and its visible portion is the mastoid process here. So petromastoid bone, or petrous portion of the temporal bone. There are sinuses in the sagittal section. This sinus here is the frontal sinus. This one is the sphenoidal sinus. And there's this lodge here, which in life holds the pituitary gland. This is called the sella turcica. Turcica. Now we turn to the ethmoid region, which is the region of the skull forming the walls of the nasal cavities. So the ethmoid bone have several subparts. It comprises these black labeled part here, or bone, called the cribriform plate, which has pores in it, because this is where the olfactory nerves will pass through, coming from the nose into your brain. Cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. It's also visible when viewed from the foramen magnum. So I don't know if you'll see it, but if you peer through the foramen magnum, you'll see that sieve-like plate over there at the end. That's the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid bone also forms the nasal septum, which divides the two nasal cavities. But we don't have any. Here. You see, if you look into the external nares, there's a partition there that divides the left and right nasal cavities. So that's part of the ethmoid bone. You can call it the nasal septum or the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. Okay, so when the cat skull is sectioned perfectly, like in a mid-sagittal plane, you will be able to see the nasal septum here, but it's not In this case, it's not a perfect mid-sagittal section, so you won't see, it doesn't contain the perpendicular plate anymore. What you see instead are these scroll-like bony structures called the nasal conchae or turbinated bones, also part of the ethmoid bone. There are 3 subparts of the turbinated bones surrounding the nasal cavity. This portion here near the cribriform plate is the ethmoturbinal. Then the one on top there are the nasoturbinals. And the one here more anteriorly are the maxilloturbinals. So ethmoturbinals, maxilloturbinals, nasoturbinals. So to repeat, the ethmoid bone is composed of the cribriform plate, the nasal septum or perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, and the turbinated bones, which is composed of the ethmo, maxillo, and nasoturbinals. We turn to the cat's mandibles or the lower jaw. The mandible of mammals is composed of only one type of bone, the dentary, which is a dermal bone. So this is only the dentary. It has various subparts. This portion here, articulating with the skull, its backside, is its ramus. So plural, these are the rami of the dentary. And this horizontal portion here is the body of the dentary bone. The left and right dentary bones are connected in the midline via a mandibular symphysis. This dorsal projection of the dentary is called the coronoid process. This one, below it, which bears the articular surface for the skull, is called the condyloid process, and it fits with the mandibular fossa here of the temporal bone. Condyloid process, mandibular fossa, coronoid process. And there are foramina here on the lateral surface called the mental foramina for the passage of the trigeminal nerve branches. There's a huge foramen here on the medial side called the mandibular foramen, also for passage of the branches of the trigeminal nerve. What about the teeth? The teeth of mammals are specialized into incisors, most of which have already been dislocated. So these are the incisors. There's a long canine, and these are the cheek teeth, subdivided into premolars and molars. So these are the premolars. There's a tiny molar there. In the lower jaw, those are the incisors, canine. The cheek teeth composed of the premolars. These two are the premolars. This thing here is the molar. So the molars of the lower jaw are much larger compared to the molars of the upper jaw. And this space in between the canines and the cheek teeth is called the diastema.